refers to as polar cap absorption and gyro frequency absorption effects. However, if they are not present, you can take advantage of gray line DXing on 160. So again, why is the gray line thought to be so efficient? At sunset, the lower D layer is no longer illuminated, therefore absorption is reducing. The higher F levels are still illuminated, so we still have ionization to aid propagation. But at sunrise, the reverse occurs. At sunrise, that D layer is going to start to rebuild, and its absorptive capacity is going to increase. Now, I do want you guys to understand that they're now talking about life in Great Britain. But what they're saying here is, at sunrise, you know, some of their interests, well, they want to work South Africa, and they want to do it in August. Well, north-south, the terminator passes at an angle that makes that a relatively easy pickup to do, even though the distances involved are pretty significant. But also applied across the darkness path over the Pacific to get them access to ZLs over in New Zealand. And essentially this is going to be a seasonal thing, because again, the location of the terminator is going to differ depending upon the seasons. Now, for a while, what it does is just go through some of the empirical observations about their testing experiences, and it tends to go on for a number of pages, so I'm going to skip ahead. Actually, let's do it this way. All right, now, at this point, they've gone through a bunch of empirical evaluation, and here's what they come back with. What they say is their results are showing that, in fact, there are increased efficiencies by employing a gray line strategy. And what they indicated was that on 40, it's every bit that the models would predict. On 80 and 160, though, it's a little bit less demonstrable as a phenomenon. And in fact, any of you guys devotees of John D. Voltaire, and do you know who he is? This is the guy that writes low band DXing. He's the famous international Belgian DXer. You hear him on the air a lot during competitions. He's got his own theory of gray line propagation. And what he says is, because he's a 160 expert, is though all the gray line does seem to work, that the best signal strengths are in fact stations that are a few miles perpendicular to the gray line. So, not exactly working in the manner that anticipated, but still somewhat true to the model. That's what their empirical results have shown. But for 40, it's a demonstrable relationship. But what they're getting into now is they're saying, look, if gray line DXing does not explain some of the efficiencies of signal transmission they've seen, what does? They're saying there's the alternative explanation for contacts occurring at sunrise and sunset, and that's when they begin to refer to the sunrise signal enhancement phenomenon and the sunset signal enhancement phenomenon. And that's what they're alluding to.
So those are basically one-way contacts rather than two-way.
Well, people are talking to one another, but the station that's confronting the dusk or the dawn, again, is not passing through the absorptive D layer. So their signal is going to be proportionally stronger to the receiving station than the station that's in the dark, trying to in turn talk to the station in the lit area. Okay, this is them quoting ON4UN, my buddy John D. Voltaire, suggests that 160 to 80 meter signals are best at right angles to the terminator, and only 40 meter signals tend to follow a gray line path. Now again, my experience has been to try and work gray line mostly on 40. 40 is my favorite contest band to just get on and listen to for signals. I have done a little bit on 80 though, and it does seem to be a provable phenomenon. Again, what they're saying is there's some adherence to the model, it's just not quite what they would expect. And sometimes you get some signals from stations originating at right angles to where they should be that are still somehow being able to take advantage of the gray line phenomenon. What he does say, though, and this is a contribution from a fellow N4KG, and in the citations I'll send to anyone that's interested, we'll quote his article. It says that when you want to take advantage of the signal enhancement modes, that on 80 and 40 meters, the signals are always going to peak after sunrise. Have I seen this? I've seen this personally. There have been nights when I didn't want to stay up till sunrise. You've been operating all night in a contest, and I start to doze off. But I seldom go home before sunup because I'm thinking I want to work Japan just to say I did for purposes of this contest. And no kidding, if you just wait till about 15 minutes after sunup, Japan comes in like gangbusters. You'll hear them for 15 or 20 minutes, and then they'll disappear like they were never there in the first place. And that's the classic example. Because remember, when you're dealing with what's referred to as the sunrise optimization, right? That's coming from the west. In our case, I'm here in North America, and the signals are rolling in from Asia. On 160, the relationship is just a little different. They can peak at sunrise and sunset, but they can also peak during darkness. Why? Because in essence, 160 is the least predictable band in the amateur spectrum when it comes to overall propagation.
Actually, I had a neighbor who had a 40-meter beam up,
Right?
running a KW,
Right?
CW, working Japan every morning.
Right.
And I knew he was working it because my fluorescent tubes in my bathroom light would be going
Oh, yeah,
according to his CW.
right. Right. Here's the question, though, that I would just be curious about. It does sound to me like he's doing gray line. But you know a little bit about beam headings. Where was the beam headed at that point? Was it pointed directly at Japan?
I was still half asleep. I wasn't even looking at it.
Right. Because the different theories of how to take advantage of DX, or gray line DXing, are going to have a little bit of a discussion with respect to, okay, so are you pointing the antenna directly at Japan? Or are you pointing the antenna at the beginning of the gray line path to Japan?
I'm not sure.
And there's some discussion about which works out the best.
I was just cursing him out and closing the bathroom door.
Right. So you had a ham as a next door neighbor?
Yeah,
Well, they make lousy next door neighbors.
I've got one now.
Do you really, huh? All right. Basically, that's it for this part of the presentation, but let's talk about what their conclusions they came to after their exhaustive study. Yes, gray line DXing is there, but it's not nearly as efficient on 160 and 80 as it is on 40. I can attest through personal experience, it does work for a fact on 40, and I've seen signs of it working on 80, because it's the same scenario. I've been up at the museum using my OCF dipole up around 70 feet, which is not that high for 80-meter work. And no lie, in conjunction with my local sunset, enrolls the Asiatic parts of the Soviet Union. And I work them easily. No linear, 100 watts, and I get 5.9 signal reports. But no kidding, you hear them 15 minutes, and they're gone. Right? So, one bit of advice that's listed in one of the other PowerPoints is this. If you tend to use a lot of gray line DXing because you're trying to make DXCC or work country number 300, log that information as soon as you make the QSO. You want the signal report and you want to confirm the call. Why? Because you know what? A minute or two later, the signal may be gone and you may not be hearing the guy. All right. There may be true gray line effects on 40 meters, and they said they did this in conjunction with their testing, I think that was working with Bermuda. And they also indicate, though, that one of the failings of the predictive model for gray line DXing is the fact that delayer absorption sometimes is going to continue to take place based on solar events that don't have a lot directly to do with sunup or sundown. Okay, so advice when you're operating in a contest, or whether you're just trying to work some good long-haul DX to regions of the country that you've not, right? Always expect enhancements at your local sunrise going to anywhere, right? But also focus on the sunrise versus sunset disposition on the countries that you're trying to work, because that's going to play a role. Also notice that you want to look for enhancements from DX stations across the dark zone at their sunset or sunrise. And for this, in order for this to work, you have to be in darkness on one of the low frequency bands. All right, now, That's it in terms of what I wanted to do for the formal presentation. And again, for anyone that's interested in a syllabus of the content that went into this, I will be happy to provide all of it. This does, though, give some URLs for gray line information that you can take advantage of your own. All right? But you've seen the largely theoretical presentation. One more time, let's pull up that map. Oh, also, by the way, the N4KG article that was just quoted in this Radio Society of Great Britain article is this baby that they're referring to right here. Again, it will be listed in the syllabus. But again, here, they're giving their sunrise enhancement and sunset enhancement definitions. It says sunrise enhancement accounts for the peak associated with signals coming from the westerly directions that are not on the gray line, but are frequently mistaken or referred to as being gray line. So like I said, the phenomena are considered to be related, and they can both be traced by the same gray line map. Sunset enhancement is exactly the opposite. Accounts for the peak associated with signals coming from the easterly direction. That's me at sunset hearing the stations in the Asiatic part of the Soviet Union as an example. The one thing that he makes, which I find interesting, is I do know that we've discussed at one time another propagation predicting programs, and what the author is insisting on, and there seems to be large support in the knowledgeable ham community, is that all these propagation programs that will predict the best circumstances for which you can work in a particular zone or particular country never take into consideration gray line or the sunset or the sunrise enhancement scenario, which they just describe as a major failing of a lot of the software that does that. So, have any of you actually gotten on under sunrise and sundown conditions and experienced some of the phenomenon that we're describing? I mean, I know I've seen the evidence of it clear as day. You've seen it in the context of doing some in-depth operating during contests.
Through the years, but lately, I don't get up that early, I don't go to bed that late.
It's all easy for me to talk about now, guys. I'm retired. But like I say, think back to that notion of hams having to be up at all hours of the day or night to work countries of their choice. While that may be true, when you're the guy in the dark and the station that you're trying to work is a station where you're trying to use the signal enhancement technique. All right? But also understand that you definitely want to devote a major percentage of your operating time to sunup and sundown, especially if you're a 160 meter operator, because working for some of those DX stations can be the supreme challenge. Now, Dr. John, you had brought up that aspect, I think, that just talking about the changing. Yeah, here we go. Working the gray line. So this is the more involved discussion here, because John made the point that, well, okay, that terminator is going to be affected by the seasons, isn't it? Take a look. And here's where they get into the analysis. It says the gray line usually runs in a north-south direction, but due to the inclination of the Earth on its orbital plane, it varies up to 23 degrees either side of the twilight zone. At the equinoxes, the gray line runs exactly north to south. So when you're that 160 station and you're trying to work South America, right? Pure gray line. East Coast North America, East Coast South America, Central America. But, interestingly enough, at summer in the Northern Hemisphere, the gray line is tilted to 23 degrees to the north, and 6 months later, at the beginning of winter, is tilted 23 degrees to the south. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of people will say I'm crazy when I make the next statement, which is, people tend to look at 160 as a band that you use only during the winter. And boy, if you've ever heard the noise on that band during the summer, you'll understand why people say that. But you know what's interesting? Is to some parts of the world, you still get very effective propagation on 160, but you need a low noise receiving antenna to work it. And so for some folks who are desperate to work stations in the Southern Hemisphere, they will use beverage antennas, which don't pick up much in the way of noise, use a low noise amplifier to basically bump up the signal strength. And as a result, you'll actually be able to work 160 during the summer. And that's where the different angle here of the terminator line is going to come into play.
They're using that for receive only.
I'm sorry?
They're using that for receive
Right.
only.
Yeah, let's make this clear. For a lot of 160 stations, it's 2 antennas. Almost the universal antenna for broadcasting or for transmitting is going to be a vertical of one form or another. If it's not a straight vertical, it's going to be an inverted L. Your beverage antennas, if you've ever heard of the pennant antenna is another example, are receive-only antennas. And you think to yourself, but yeah, wasn't I taught on my license exams that the attributes of an antenna that make it good for transmitting also make it good for receiving? For every other band than 160, that's a true description. But 160 is just an inherently noisy band, so the use of a low noise receiving antenna enables you to hear under low noise conditions. You transmit with a vertical, which tends to be very noisy, but your assumption is what? The guy on the other end is using a Foursquare, or a beverage, or a pennant antenna that's a low noise antenna. Okay? But that's basically what all the concept is all about. So, observation. How do you get your hands on this gray line map? I kid you not. Go to Google. Type in gray line map. But what you may want to do is mix in the combination of your Google search, ham radio gray line map. Because if you don't, what are you going to get?
Bus.
You're going to get the bus lines down here. Yeah, this, huh? What? And it finally occurred to me to put that up on the lookup string. But you will go, there's probably 50 different websites out there that offer this baby. And like I say, it's freeware. You're not paying for anything for it. This laptop set me back $450. This one application alone, right, saves me, what, $450 over buying that crazy mechanical map. And all it was this map that looked like a bunch of Venetian wines vertically that would move on a chain, guys. I kid you not. And it started out at $2,000.
That's the first, yours is the first one that popped up on the Google site.
So you managed to find it as soon as you did the Google search. And what did you do for your lookup?
I did ham, gray line.
Okay.
It filled in
Is
that.
there an app for it?
No, an app. Oh, it's
Right,
I
it's-
don't know if it's straight up.
It's not unusual for me when I'm operating all night during a competition that, obviously my logging software is on this PC, but I will have this tab up and active. And no kidding, the stations roll in a predictive fashion based on the onset
Thing.
of the passage of the sun.
You get a first lecture that actually made some sense about what the hell we do in ham radio.
Don't tell them that.
In 10 years in this club,
Right. I
no
don't
one
mean,
gave up the secret.
sure, I don't mean to make fun of C-beers, because, some of them find their way into ham radio, and some of them viscerally know propagation better than some hams, all right? But here's the way I would put it. As a kid, I thought you turned on the radio and you got lucky. Do you know what I'm saying? In other words, well, it comes in when it comes in. Whoa, how come I heard Japan and you didn't? Because I was on the air at 6:30 in the morning and you weren't. But propagation strikes you as random in the early years of your ham radio career. What you find out is it's not random at all. It's extremely predictable, right? And the onset of the D layers, right? It's building its disintegration. Now you can apply it, I think, and get a better idea as to what's going on. But I will tell you, have you ever listened to a couple theoretical propagation whizzes? Your Harvard engineer types who will be at one of the national ARRL
Can't
conventions.
understand them.
And they talk about working their friends at the antipode. And they go on and they're using these. What the hell are they talking about? But you know what, guys? Remember Newton? Goes up, it comes down. If it doesn't, it's VHF. Right? And up at the observatory, we're answering questions all the time. Well, how do they talk to the moon? I mean, what's the skip to the moon? There isn't. It's VHF, it's UHF. What do? You point.
Line of sight.
Is there any, exactly, is there any D-layer absorption involved? No, there isn't. And interestingly enough, what are the power levels? They're not that high. It's the gain antennas that they're using. That's when it's all said and done, are getting them out there. Stupidest comment, though, ever made about the radio transmission. This was at another observatory. Guy says, well, it's well known that the moon is always closest to the Earth when it rises above the ocean, because after all, if you could just travel into the ocean, you're at the moon, so why don't you just shoot the signals up, when the moon is rising or when the moon is setting? Under the notion that you can sail a boat to the moon. Well, there's some folks out there, guys, that don't know much about astronomy or propagation.
Off the edge
There is
before
an
you get
effect,
there.
though. When you're close to the horizon, there is an enhancement, not having to do with the refraction and whatnot. But then for satellites, there's a
I think that if you're going at a lower angle, you're not passing through quite as much junk, I guess is the way I would describe it.
I forgot the whole technology of exactly what there is an effect. And I also was thinking, there is another way to explore this. This is one place where this map exists, and that is on reverse beacon.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking the same thing.
And you can go and look at sunrise and find a station that's a reverse beacon near where you are, and see what they're picking up.
Right.
And that also whisper probably would also be another way to try to measure this phenomenon.
Right. When I was a novice and didn't have high frequency sideband privileges, I was still an avid SWL. And no kidding, Gray Line first came hit home with me when I started to listen to Radio Australia and heard them come up every day in the early morning as soon as the sun came up. All right, so that's it for this presentation. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to ask them. But again, for anyone interested, I'll be happy to send along the syllabus. The other thing I was asked to do was tell a little bit of our story and success up at the Hamfest, and also talk a little bit about an off-the-grid operating experience I had back in Maine. So we'll segue into that in just a minute. Ernest, you had a question?
Sunspot activity, how does that affect the gray line?
I'm in direct correlation at best. Okay? During periods of high sunspot activity, the absorption in the D layer will increase proportionally. But you can still take advantage of gray line regardless, basically, of what the ionospheric propagation is like.
So a sunspot activity, if it was enhanced, would create a density in the D layer?
Yes. So, it's kind of a mixed blessing. The point I would make to you, though, is this. There's a lot of you folks who've been in ham radio for a couple of solar cycles. Stan, you've been in this for
Couple of days.
4 solar cycles.
Since the Maunder minimum.
I've been in this.
I've had a couple of good ones pass, but I haven't been on
Right.
yet.
I've been in for maybe 3.5. Guys, yeah, whether we're in the modern minimum or not, there's some debate, is our sun, in terms of sunspot numbers, going down on a permanent basis? Are we in a cycle? Who knows? But you know what? If you didn't experience the cycle in the 70s, and if you didn't have your mentors tell you about the cycle experienced in the 50s, you have no idea what ham radio is all about.
You mean when you got on 10 meters and
Right.
worked the world?
We had
every
guys
day
with crappy
from the
equipment.
car?
I've got some of the rigs that were used that I've got through an estate sale at home. I've got a National 200X. I've got a Tempo 1. Do you remember what pieces of crap these rigs were? And you'd have people go, well, you could say what you want about my rig, but I fired it up on 10 meters the other day and it's 7 o'clock at night. 7 o'clock at night! I was working Siberia and the guy told me I was 5'9 plus 40. For some of you guys who are relative newcomers, it's a shame that you didn't come on board to see a couple of those cycles because they were just amazing. Guys that would get on and would work 300 countries in 2 to 3 years on 10 years.
You wonder what happened to amateur radio nowadays.
Well, can I just make the following observation? And I say this all the time. Is propagation that bad? No, it isn't. People are too lazy to get on the air and operate. Americans are bored about talking to other Americans. Europeans are especially bored about talking to Americans. The only time these people come out of the woodwork is during contests because everybody is a QSO and everybody has points. And when those contests come out, what do they prove? The contest operators are a real pain in the ass if you're not into contesting. But what they also prove is if people just get on the air and they operate, the conditions are much better than anybody truly realizes.
I used to have the QSO every night going home from work,
Right?
between 12 and 2 a.m.
Right.
with a guy in Russia, in the Kremlin, and a guy had an island just off Italy.
Right.
And every night from the car, we'd have our conversation for my 15-minute drive home.
Yeah, just know one
Those
thing.
days are not there today.
Socialism be damned. If you work anybody in Europe, there's one of 2 explanations behind their good signal. One is they're either a billionaire, or 2, you're talking to a club station. But this is not a middle-class hobby in Europe, not by any stretch.
Well, the guy in the Kremlin, I have no idea what he did or where,
Yeah, well.
but he was a block from.
He worked for the
was a block from
KGB.
the Kremlin,
He worked
in
for
a
the
hotel,
KGB and he
with
loved
beam
you.
up on the top on the roof.
Right?
And they kept asking you about what you do about nuclear energy.
No,
Right,
we
right,
never
right.
talked politics or anything. The guy in Italy owned the island. They had a farm on there, and
The
the
island was
kids from
Sicily?
the kids from the farmers would take a boat over to the mainland every day to go to school.
Right.
And he was a hog aficionado, Harley Davidson.
Right.
I arranged for a hog for him, which he sent the money over. They shipped it over to him for his island.
Okay, well,
You got it?